Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a really fascinating journey, I think, into how the witch archetype has evolved,
Hmm.
tracing it from, this figure of actual historical terror linked to suppressed female power, all the way to what we often see now
Hmm.
in pop culture, which can be, well, a bit sanitized
Right,
sometimes.
yeah, sanitized, but still really prevalent. And we've got some great material to unpack this. We'll be looking at the stark reality of the European witch trials,
Yeah.
Silvia Federici's analysis, which is incredibly insightful about the motivations behind them,
Okay.
and then jumping into how contemporary media, movies, TV, books portrays witches now.
So the goal is really to understand not just the what, how the image changed, but the why and the how.
Yeah,
What connections still exist between that historical repression and how these figures are framed for us today.
exactly. What are the continuities? That's the core question we're trying to get at.
Okay, let's start with the history then, because the
Right.
sheer scale, it's kind of staggering. We're talking, what, 1300 to 1850-ish?
Roughly, yeah. And estimates are somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 executions across Europe.
40 to 60,000.
And the peak intensity, the real frenzy, was between about 1580 and 1630. Germany saw the highest numbers, but also Switzerland, France, Hungary. It was widespread.
And it's crucial to look at the why, isn't it? Why did this happen on such a scale? You mentioned Federici.
Yes, Silvia Federici. Her work frames the witch hunt as, and this is a direct quote, a mass assault on their bodies, organized at the international level, legally sanctioned, and blessed by the church.
Wow. So not just random fear, but something systemic, organized.
Very much so. She argues it was instrumental in creating a specific model of womanhood,
Which was?
essentially asexual, obedient, submissive, confined to this economically devalued domestic sphere. It wasn't just about religion, it tied into social and economic control.
Okay, that makes sense. Connecting it to, say, the rise of capitalism, the cementing of patriarchy,
Yeah,
you need to control female autonomy for that system to work smoothly.
precisely. And the early witch archetype, the figure before and during the peak hunts, stood in complete opposition to that model.
How so? What did that archetype represent?
Well, our sources describe her as a liminal figure, kind of on the edge, right? Both a healer, maybe using herbs and traditional knowledge, but also potentially a poisoner, someone dangerous.
Possessing knowledge passed down among women.
Exactly. Independent. Not needing male authority figures or fitting neatly into societal norms.
The material mentions her independence, her power, the chaos surrounding her, reestablishing a new order. That sounds inherently challenging to a rigid structure.
Absolutely. That independence, that power, it was the threat. That's why she was constructed as dangerous. The hunts weren't just about stamping out evil spells. They were a deliberate process based on distrust, suspicion, aimed at controlling them and rendering them harmless.
And the method, burning at the stake. The symbolism there is brutal.
Incredibly potent. The idea that nothing must remain of them. Our source is quite clear. That of burning at the stake is a strategy of control. Autonomous and influential women must be repressed. They cannot and must not show the world their power. It's about erasure.
Erasing that image of self-sufficiency, of power outside the approved channels.
And the label itself, witch, became this incredibly effective way to silence anyone who deviated.
Just slap that label on, and suddenly anything that woman says is delegitimized. She's outside the bounds of acceptable society.
Stripped of credibility, voice, basically her right to participate.
Okay, so that's the incredibly dark historical backdrop. Now let's fast forward. Today, witches are everywhere in pop culture. Novels, films, TV shows, music.
Everywhere. But as the material notes, often seen through a new and ambiguous perspective, the terror is often gone or transformed.
Yeah, the figure seems frequently redeemed, but maybe also domesticated. Often shown as a victim, maybe seeking redemption.
That domesticated aspect is really key, I think, especially when we're talking through a lens of gender theory. When the witch is primarily framed as a victim, or her power is solely a reaction to trauma, it kind of neutralizes that original, potentially disruptive essence, doesn't it?
It makes her relatable, maybe sympathetic, but less inherently powerful in her own right. Less of a challenge to the status quo.
Potentially, yes. Her strength becomes about overcoming adversity, which is admirable, but it shifts the focus from intrinsic, independent power that might be seen as threatening.
Let's look at some examples. Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, is a huge one right
A
now.
really complex example, yeah.
Yeah.
The material points out her magic is so deeply tied to loss, specifically missed motherhood.
And it also notes that her full power often seems expressed only in solitude when she is sure she can do no harm. Like, there's a limitation, even in her most powerful moments.
Right, and that's interesting from a critical perspective.
Yeah.
Even when she accesses this immense power, it's often framed within these very specific emotional contexts: grief, loss, protection, or happens when she's isolated. It could be read as a way that the narrative contains that power, keeping it from being purely agentic or disruptive within the main societal structure of the story. It happens on a limited and narrow path, as the source says.
Then you have Agatha Harkness in the same story world. She's different.
Very different. Not driven by trauma in the same way. She's aware of her knowledge. She claims her power. She seems to relish it.
And what happens to her?
She's punished, basically confined, stripped of her power, forced into the role of this average, powerless woman.
Which connects right back to the historical fear, doesn't it? A woman consciously wielding great power, not justifying it through suffering? That still seems to be portrayed as something that needs to be controlled.
Exactly. It aligns almost too neatly with those old patriarchal anxieties. If a woman isn't suffering or reacting, but actively choosing power, the narrative often finds a way to neutralize her.
And this theme of exile keeps coming up. The material mentions forced marginalization as often the only path for pop culture witches who do reclaim their power. They end up on the fringes.
Yeah, look at Elphaba from Wicked, another fascinating case.
Right, because she chooses to become the Wicked Witch. It's presented as an act of resistance, affirming her identity against a corrupt system.
Definitely an element of emancipation there. Rejecting corrupt society, finding freedom in that rejection.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Seems so. The very high price is exile. She gains her perspective, her power, but always observes society through a glass, remaining separate and distant. She can't integrate.
The text really emphasizes that she remains distinct and separate, and her survival kind of depends on keeping that distance.
And Cynthia Erivo, who played her, had that great quote about Elphaba being a symbol for anyone disparaged, demonized, and discriminated against, asserting her right to exist in all her power. It connects the witch archetype to broader marginalized experiences.
Which is powerful. But the narrative result is still separation, marginalization as the cost of power.
It keeps reinforcing that theme. The powerful witch figure often can't seem to fully exist within society. She has to remain apart.
So pulling these threads together, what's the bigger picture here? The material kind of suggests that maybe, despite everything, the world still isn't quite ready for truly powerful women.
That's a really potent takeaway, especially for anyone looking at this through a gender studies or media studies lens. The fact that the dominant portrayal often feels like this sweetened and tamed version could signal a continuing societal discomfort with female power that isn't easily controlled or defined by traditional roles.
So instead of, burning at the stake.
Right, the control mechanisms shift. Modern narratives might use exile or even have the character self-sabotage or frame her power as inherently dangerous to herself or others. It suggests an ongoing unease with female power that feels too unwieldy.
And the text even brings up how magic itself is sometimes portrayed, like in some modern practices or neo-pagan contexts.
Yeah, it points out that witch magic is often depicted as chaotic, irrational, and instinctive,
As opposed to
a methodical and rational reality associated with the male, which, reinforces a pretty old gendered power dynamic right there.
Okay, so if magic itself is framed that way, it makes the witch figure seem
Almost exotic, as the text puts it. Interesting, maybe commercially viable for stories, but not necessarily presented as a source of true liberation or a real challenge to existing structures.
there's always something holding them back, some push towards containment, towards domestication.
Which leads to the conclusion that the modern pop culture, which might be a kind of illusion, an emancipation by halves that consoles without transforming.
That's a strong statement. An illusion of empowerment.
It mirrors that broader paradox, right? How women's strength is often celebrated today, but usually only within the limits of what is controllable and harmless.
So, the way we use the witch figure now, it might actually serve to tranquilize those old fears, offer this contained version of female power so we don't have to confront the idea of truly autonomous, perhaps disruptive female agency.
That's the core tension the material highlights. It leaves us with that critical question. Are we really facing the purest form of emancipation? Or is the witch a narrative domesticated by patriarchy?
There's a lot to think about. So we've traced this arc from violent suppression of perceived independent female power
Yeah, a figure targeted for death.
to this complex, often compelling, but frequently contained figure in our modern stories.
And that continuity is what's really striking for media analysis. Those historical methods of control, silencing, marginalizing, defining roles strictly seem to echo in the narrative strategies used today, even in stories that seem progressive on the surface. They often still neutralize or sideline powerful women.
Which definitely leaves a final thought for you, the listener.
Yeah.
As you watch movies, read books, consume any media featuring witches. Really think about it. Are these portrayals genuinely pushing boundaries? Or do they subtly reinforce old limitations on female autonomy? What does real, uncompromised emancipation actually look like in these stories?
It's definitely something worth keeping in mind, a question to mull over as you engage with this really enduring, really fascinating archetype.